think this whole system of taboos, the emotional regime we exist in, simply means that anyone who's challenging these things is like they're at the bottom of the hill, and the small number of activists are at the top of the hill throwing the rocks down. It's much easier to be there.
Welcome to This Isn't Working, the podcast for employers and employees who think it's time to talk about the failings of workplace culture and how we can do better. I'm your host, Tanya de Grunwald, an HR commentator who's watching, listening, and hopefully asking the right questions. Okay, let's get this working.
Oh, thank you very much. Well, welcome to the first ever live episode of This Isn't Working, recorded at the Battle of Ideas in London. Today's episode is titled, it's really hard to say, I can't believe I actually wrote this, Who Will Win the War on Woke Workplaces? To answer that question, I'm joined by Eric Kaufmann, who is Professor of Politics at the University of Buckingham and author of Taboo, How Making Race Sacred Produced a Cultural Revolution. Thank you so much for joining us, Eric.
I'm not sure I've got any sound, or do I? Ah, there we go.
Right.
All right.
All right, thank you so much.
Okay.
I think let's clarify some terms and set some context initially. I've actually tried to steer away from using the word woke too much on the podcast, mainly because I think it's can be quite politically loaded, and I've tried to occupy a sort of sensible, centrist kind of place, which I think is actually what people seem to like about the podcast. But I do think it can be quite a useful term to kind of set out as a sort of shorthand what is a sort of particular type of workplace that I think a lot of people here today will certainly recognise the main features of. How do you define woke, and how would somebody know if their workplace was woke?
Right, okay. So I'm a social scientist, and I actually believe in concepts that they should have real meaning in the world, and I think the term woke is analytically useful. Like, quite apart from its functioning as an epithet, I think it's analytically useful. The definition of woke I go with is the making sacred of historically marginalized race, gender, and sexual identities. That is woke in one sentence. So if you think about that definition, what you're doing is you're focusing on certain categories and certain groups and making them sacred. So if anybody says something that could be interpreted by the most sensitive member imaginable of one of these groups as offensive, you have committed a kind of blasphemy, and therefore you must be excommunicated or canceled. And that's sort of where cancel culture comes from. It's like you've profaned the sacred by saying, anyone can make it in Britain. You're denying structural racism, and therefore you're offending people of color, and therefore you've committed a grave sin. So that's what I mean by woke. Now, it's also worth saying that there's another dimension, which is, so I've talked about particular groups, race, gender, sexuality, the holy trinity, if you like. But there is also a kind of philosophical belief system which is about two values, basically equal outcomes and emotional harm protection or emotional safety, right? Interacted with those three groups. So if you basically the aim of a woke workplace and of DEI is for equal outcomes for the sacred groups. So that would be no race or sex gaps, for example, in earnings, in the boardroom, and so on. That's the sort of equality part. The other part is the emotional safety. You cannot have free speech because that might offend somebody else, right? So that's the other part of this. The other thing I should say is that the focus on that holy trinity, race, gender, sexual identity, minorities, means that those are the holidays. It'll be Pride Month. It'll be Black History Month. It's not going to be, Jewish Month. So you're going to have certain groups that are going to be centered. Their flags, what Ed West calls the high holy days for those groups are going to be centered by the company. So that's how you know you're kind of in a woke workplace.
Can I add I think in terms of what I've seen, it's probably staff networks as well to play quite a big role, these sort of little mini groups that are existing within organisations, which may have been a good idea for 5 minutes and should probably be knocked on the head sooner. I think there's a lot about kind of speech codes as well that you mentioned. I think a lot of people have felt that very quickly when you use the wrong word. I know somebody who got kicked out of a meeting for using the word urban. Somebody else used the word curve. Someone else said blind spot was a no. And I actually got called a white supremacist for using the phrase most reasonable people. So it's very real out there. I think in terms of a kind of HR perspective, if I can just add a little bit, I think I've seen lots of organizations spend an awful lot of time and money on things like recruitment and progression, which I mean promotion, and very little thinking about things like retention. It's all about who you include, and they don't tend to spend a lot of time thinking about who they're excluding by doing all this stuff. And so I think they're now beginning to realize that they've lost some of their best people, many of whom will be in this room today, by enforcing some of these sorts of rules. There is a sort of cotton wool around certain groups, and there's also a kind of extreme harshness around other groups. Is there any logic to which groups are protected and which groups are cast out very harshly?
Well, I mean, it is essentially based around that making sacred. So there are the sacred categories: race, gender, sexual orientation. I wouldn't say, for example, that disability is a sacred category. I mean, you don't sort of have a situation where they say companies are jockeying to say we have more people in wheelchairs than you do on our board, or you had a panel and there's no one in a wheelchair. I mean, that's not actually something that comes up. So I don't think that's sacred. It's also worth saying that clearly when they say bring your whole self to work, they're not talking about Brexiteers or conservatives or gender-critical feminists. So there are very clear exclusions that they practice, and there are certain categories that they want to promote. So that's all I'm saying is the idea that they are being inclusive is simply nonsense. They're just choosing different groups to focus on.
And so why do you think it's been so hard for people to challenge woke in the workplace? Woke is, I mean, some of the ideas are just bad, and they don't have any data behind them. The people pushing this stuff, in my experience, are not terribly bright, quite often, and the people who are challenging them do tend to be kind of the smarter people, I think, who are just like, where's the data behind this? Have you thought about the unintended consequences? Why is it so slippery to challenge? Why do people in this audience end up blue in the face and then, in some kind of grievance procedure when actually they're probably right to challenge this stuff?
Well, the main reason I would say is because the public morality, so the taboos that exist in our society are all the progressive taboos around race, gender, sexuality, for example. And therefore, even if you have a majority of people who oppose something like mandatory diversity statements in universities, no one's going to speak up, because all of a sudden, if you speak up, you're going to be radioactive because you can be associated with violating a taboo. So I think this whole system of taboos, the emotional regime we exist in, simply means that anyone who's challenging these things is like they're at the bottom of the hill, and the small number of activists are at the top of the hill throwing the rocks down. It's much easier to be there. And so I think it just makes it extremely difficult to overturn any of these things.
I'd like to point to a couple of examples of even outsiders, I think, have found this stuff difficult to dislodge. So I would include the government's Inclusion at Work report, which was published in spring 2024. That was the one commissioned by Kemi Badenoch and chaired by Pamela Dow, which was actually an excellent report. It was actually really, it was really sensible recommendations, really solid experts. It sank like a stone. I don't think anyone even read it. And that was a really meaty report. That was a really good piece of work. There's also been the forensic debunking of the idea that demographic DEI leads to higher profits. So the 4 McKinsey reports, which also turn out to be extremely lightweight, if not non-existent, that data. And I'd point to Alex Edmonds, who is incredibly clever, who is also blue in the face from having to try to tell people that there isn't actually any data behind this. So it doesn't seem to sort of stick, and I still hear people talking about the McKinsey reports. I mean, right. McKinsey is a huge name in the business world and has a huge amount of credibility, which is why it's probably got this far. But it's been debunked, so can we move on? But we can't move on. So in that way, do you think woke is like a religion? Is that what people are dealing with, and is that why they're getting the response they get when they challenge it?
Yeah, I mean, there's two aspects. The true believers it's very much like a religion. As I mentioned, there's sacred, profane violations of the sacred lead to you being excommunicated. I mean, I was just recently on a panel at one of these sort of mining trade associations that was very into DEI, and they had Joanna Williams, who I don't know is here, but and myself on one side, to their credit, and then they had some DEI people on the other. And so we were bringing up all this stuff, and all these studies that show it worsens employee race relations. It doesn't improve any outcomes that are measurable. they didn't engage, the diversity people didn't engage at all. It was they just trotted out the same old boilerplate, right? And it's just a mantra. But I think for the rest, for the silent majority, if you like, they are scared to challenge this mainly because of the power of these progressive taboos that exist in society that the woke key in on and weaponize. And so it's very difficult, even if you've got a majority who are opposed to this, to overturn it. And actually, that's why a lot of this will live on like a zombie, even if woke loses popularity culturally. Actually, to root this stuff out is going to take, I think it's going to take government intervention to get it out. I don't approve of everything that Trump is doing, but I think an approach that involves really getting your fingers into these institutions is going to be necessary actually to get this stuff out.
There are some signs that things are changing and shifting a little bit, particularly in the last year, I think. So what do you think have been the significant moments in the last 12 months that suggest that there is moves to change some of this stuff?
Well, you're closer to the coalface than I am in a way in terms of workplaces. What I can say is certainly if we look at the U.S. case, because there has been a political shift and a so-called vibe shift, we see the mention of terms like white supremacy and patriarchy dropping in the New York Times. The number of left-wing cancellations of professors has dropped. All of this in the last few years. The mention of DEI at earnings calls of major corporations is down in the last 2 years. So there's no question in the U.S., partly under the pressure of Ron DeSantis, red state governors who are campaigning against ESG, partly that now with Trump. So you've had political pressure, and to some extent that's freed up, I think, presidents and executives to do things they always wanted to do but didn't have the confidence to do. I don't think that exists very strongly outside. I mean, as a Canadian living in Britain, I would say in both countries, woke is pretty entrenched, has facing, not that much opposition in elite institutions. I mean, I know you're seeing some green shoots, but I think overwhelmingly these cultures are still pretty woke.
I think I'm seeing, I am seeing fewer pronouns in bios and email signatures and things like that. And I think less of a sort of social pressure if you don't give your pronouns is what people are reporting. So I think that's probably quite a good example of that, and people just moving on. I think we've seen quite a lot of heads of DEI disappearing, or I think there have been restructures at lots of organisations anyway, and I think some organisations have taken the opportunity to say that they are distributing responsibility for DEI across the organisation, so they now don't actually need a whole role for it. That's kind of code, I think, for them saying, yeah, we're canning this. So I think there's a lot of that. I mean, that's kind of how they operate. So DEI budgets, I think, are being cut. I think we're seeing sponsorship being down among the corporations for some of the LGBT events particularly. There's the British LGBT Awards where I think if you compare and contrast, this year versus last year, they have their branding behind them with all the logos. There's more logos last year than there were this year. This year, if you look at the boarding, you realise it's actually the same 3 logos, just repeated a lot to make it look like there are loads of sponsors and there aren't. And then there's the DEI trainers who are generally reporting online that business is down and that the phone is not ringing. And I think they tell you when it's going well. They also tell you when it's going badly. These are people that are not very good at emotional recalibration, or it's all out there for you to see. So if it was going well, they would be saying, hey, here's me outside Barclays, hey, here's me outside Clifford Chance. I think if those companies were booking them, we would be seeing it, and we're not seeing it. There's a few that are still having weird events and things, but less of that.
Yeah, I mean, I think that is fascinating, and it does show that there is a shift. But I guess at the end of the day, what I would say is even if it does, the frequency reduces a certain amount. Is the dominant ethos going to remain essentially DEI, race, gender, sexuality being what is centered in communications, right? Even if it's mentioned less, if those are the only days that are celebrated and you're not celebrating, St. George's Day or Policeman's Day or whatever it is, then it's still skewed in that direction, even if it isn't as frequent. Similarly, we had a session on advertising, if ads are still overrepresenting certain groups, again, based on what is left-coded, essentially, and progressive-coded, I would say it's still woke, even if it is not as aggressively in-your-face woke.
Mm-hmm. Okay, we'll come back to that maybe in the questions as well from the audience. So returning to the question of who, I can't believe I wrote this, who will win the war on woke workplaces? What will the answer come down to in your view? What are the kind of push-pull factors? I know you feel that it takes a political muscle to really get this stuff kind of out of the ground in a way. What would that look like in the UK, do you think?
Well, I think that, for example, guidance around the Equality Act, this idea that you have to promote, foster good relations between groups, that sort of, the guidance would have to say, this is not about essentially affirmative action for groups. This is, essentially the legal motivation, fear of being sued, all of that kind of legal rationale needs to sort of fade away, number one, and more of an emphasis on non-discrimination and merit. So I think that's sort of what you're seeing in the US case. But I also think perhaps even trying to raise some questions about symbolism, about, if you are centering symbols that are left-coded, such as LGBT, that is actually politically, you're advantaging certain groups and you're actually excluding conservatives and religious people and so on. To make those an issue and to sort of say, we want to be politically neutral. We want workplaces to be just focused on doing good work. We don't want to bring politics in. I think that would be a nice thing to have. And I think probably government is going to have to play a role in setting incentives and amending or creating guidance around the Equality Act to make that happen.
I think I'm concerned about the university sector, as I think you are. I mean, the public sector overall. I mean, the number of people who've come up to me this weekend at my stand to say I worked in the NHS or I still work in the NHS, and that seems to be one of the worst, I would say, in terms of being behind the curve. I think the roots are very, very deep there. I think certain portions of the private sector as well. I would point to publishing, journalism, and the arts. I think those are in pretty deep trouble as far as I can see. I guess the good news from my viewpoint would be that I think some of the private sector is very different, particularly the corporations. I think we're already seeing movement in that respect. I think the profit driver is certainly returning. I think actually, in a way, some of this stuff was kind of out of character for them to even follow this stuff, because if customers don't like it, you're spending money on it, and it's actually bad for your own business from the inside. The question is, what were you ever doing any of this stuff? And I think they've always had a much better mix of people in lots of these firms, because I think they have a better social class mix, frankly. And I think they have a much better political mix. So you have plenty of people who work in big corporations, and not in the HR department, they all vote one way, but with across the kind of commercial people, the strategy people, the risk people, the people that frankly make the money for the organization and do the kind of serious jobs. There's a much better mix of people there. So I think that kind of common sense will return. And I think the go woke, go broke stuff, people quite often say that, and they're talking about customers and how much customers hate this stuff. But I think there's a lot to talk about for employers, and then you really need to dig into this, and I'm happy to help them to do this, to think about like the damage that they've done to their organisation from the inside in terms of the numbers of grievances, the commercial risk, the legal risk, the reputational risk, who they've lost as well. I just think retention has been such a big issue. They've lost so many brilliant people, and they're left with the people, the kind of nodding dogs, frankly, who thought this was all great and didn't need to be challenged, and they got rid of anybody who was saying, actually, I think there's a problem with some of this stuff. So I think there is a sort of dawning realization that this has been an act of self-harm for lots of organizations, and that it's not just about the policies, but it's kind of a bigger piece than that. And I think they're talking a lot about young people as well, and that's my kind of background, is thinking, how did young people take over like this? And young people are not actually in great shape. So is this about activists, or is this about leadership failure, which is what I think it is? I don't know if you've got any views on that one.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's probably, a bit of both. You're right that young people are a lot more woke, and if you have, town hall meetings and affinity groups where that younger staffer can kind of, we saw that at the New York Times, sort of most obviously, where they said, we don't like objectivity, we want moral clarity, quote unquote. So this is, resisting those forces. How does the C-suite kind of resist that is a big question. One thing from the universities that we see, and again, why government action may be important, is that DeSantis and Trump, what they've done is they've created a permission structure for university presidents to say, actually, we're going to be politically neutral, declare ourselves politically neutral. We're not making statements. We're getting rid of mandatory diversity statements. We're going to not do DEI. These are probably things that a lot of university presidents actually would have liked to do, but actually couldn't find the courage to do. So that's partly where sometimes culture is downstream of politics. So we haven't seen that yet in this country. And it'll be interesting to know whether DEI can go without deliberate political activity. I'm skeptical that that is the case.
I'm a bit more hopeful.
Okay.
But I'm not sure.
Good.
Yeah, I mean, I'm launching a new business network for employers, actually talking to lots of people about that today, this weekend, and I wouldn't be doing that if I didn't think I could fill a room full of people talking about this stuff, so I hope people will get some encouragement from that. I might throw out to questions now, actually. So yeah, we've got another kind of 20 minutes or so. Where are my microphone people? This gentleman here next to you. So we'll take maybe 2 or 3 at a time, maybe 3 at a time. Go ahead.
Is it working? I think what's sometimes missed with this focus on DEI, as someone who has worked in numerous firms, is that it's the weak CEO's hideaway. And I know DEI in itself is problematic, and I've seen many examples of that. But also, it's a way for someone who doesn't know what he's doing to say, oh, look at all this DEI stuff that I've done. And I've seen over and over and over again, it's the worst CEOs that are massively focused on this stuff because it enables them to demonstrate they've achieved something when actually they're not doing their job. So I think there's a hidden detriment to this, which I'm not sure is discussed often enough.
Okay, thank you. This gentleman here, and this lady here.
Yes. Hi, Eric. Yes. I wonder, I think there is a misconception that a lot of this is statutory, which it isn't. It's a lot of these things have pervaded public bodies in the first instance, and because of the overbearing regulation, the growth of state bureaucracy, that it's through public bodies that have pushed this through, mostly large corporations. And I just wondered if you could confirm. I'm thinking of, this definition of Islamophobia, for instance, is going to be non-statutory. So it's a way of sliding it in through public bodies into and through regulatory processes into corporations. So I just asked that in relation to how we're going to fight this. I think that it's the public bodies that really need to. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Okay, this lady here.
Thank you. You were talking about the several sacred groups within DEI, and what I found very interesting is that there are subsets within those groups that HR teams, EDI professionals are very quick to ignore. Either they pretend they don't exist, or they tell them to shut up. So groups like Black conservatives, EDI work assumes.
Right.
EDI, they don't even talk about brown conservatives, but never mind that. But Black conservatives who are either ignored or told to shut up, but equally detransitioners, trans widows, trans widowers, those kinds of groups. So it'd be great to hear your perspective on how you think those groups have been treated.
Go ahead.
Sure. Well, what I would say, you're absolutely right, because part of the point with the sacred groups is that the woke left, if you like, they're not actually interested necessarily in the culture of these groups as it exists in reality. So they'll create artificial components. They'll talk about BIPOC or LGBTQ, right? Those are not actual groups. Those are political constructions. And if you don't fit the role, if you don't play the role you're supposed to play, so if you are gay and you don't like the trans agenda, for example, and you're not being a good LGBTQer, then yes, you're going to be in trouble, right? So yeah, I mean, it's also worth saying, by the way, they're not interested in anything outside the sacred category. So, for example, if in the U.S. case, for example, if Black, Caribbean, and African, are making up most of the Black student body at the Ivy League universities, and the sort of descendants of Black slaves are making up a minority, that is a non-issue, actually. So that kind of, any inequality, or Gypsy and Irish travelers versus other whites, I mean, they don't care about these things, because they aren't sacralized and they're not elevated as categories.
You want to talk about CEOs?
We can talk about, these other, very good point here, this question about CEOs. Yeah, I mean, I think there's an interesting debate about how much of the woke phenomena, there's one school of thought that thinks this is kind of status belief, self-interest, cynicism to divide the working class, and these sorts of things. And it's very hard to sort of definitively prove. I sort of cleave more to this is a true belief, a true religion, that a kind of mind virus that people have kind of caught. But I take your point that there certainly are incentives. So if you're not turning a profit, or if you are, as an academic, not publishing anything of worth, then you go the DEI route, absolutely. And in terms of what Bruce was saying, yeah, the statutory, I think the important thing with the statutory stuff is that it doesn't necessarily have to be the case that you're legally obligated to do DEI, but as we see in the case of Essex University, they will point to that, misinterpret it, but use it as a sort of legitimating device. Because of the Equality Act, we must have diversity. We can't allow anything that is discriminatory against trans people, makes them feel unsafe. So they're leveraging that document in order to, even though they're doing it falsely. Yeah. So vague, anything that's vaguely worded can be willfully misinterpreted. And so you need, as a government, to have a very long document that says, this legislation doesn't mean this, it does mean that, gender ideology, critical race theory is political. You can't do that in a school. That is sort of the level we need to get to. And you're seeing that a little bit in the U.S. with some of the anti-critical race theory bills. I think it was in Nebraska where, it was 15 pages because they didn't want to have any wiggle room for the woke teacher to say, oh, well, I'm interpreting it this way.
I was just going to add on the CEOs bit that I recorded an episode called Are Activist CEOs Out of Control, which was really interesting. I actually heard more about CEOs who kind of thought, we want to do the right thing, I don't really get this stuff, young people really want us to do it, and a lot of this stuff took off kind of just before or during COVID for them, and they kind of just didn't really think it was that big a deal. They thought it was just kind of fluffed. And is there such a thing as toxic fluff? I think I need to start that. when your fluff turns toxic. So I think they're now realizing, I thought this was just all nonsense. But anyway, it's turned out to be really catastrophic for some of them. I mean, there are some that are just really, really into this stuff for their own, frankly, personal reasons. And I think I'm interested in conversations about whether those leaders should even be in the room when we're having discussions that affect policy. So particularly for someone like Virgin Active, for example, when they're being asked about their changing room policy, when having conversations about whether or not they've got this right or wrong, if there is someone senior at Virgin Active, and I don't know if there is, who has a trans-identified child, I think they should not be in the room. And that was sort of when that decision is made. And I think that was sort of the conclusion that Paul Sweeney, who was my guest for that episode, came to with that. But then Helen Joyce said, well, it's just like any other religion. And could they just say, well, of course I hold these views, but then when they join the company or take that role, they just say, well, of course I also say I will never bring those into decision-making. Is that realistic? So there's a slight difference of opinion on that. But I'm pleased that we're just starting to have those conversations now. So I'm encouraged by that, really. Okay, let's have some more questions. There was a blonde lady over here on the aisle. Oh, yeah, and you.
Thank you. You talk about government action. I just wanted your thoughts on what you think that government action should look like. Because you talk about, like the interpretation of the Equality Act and what it means. And we've got a government now that appears to be delaying the EHRC's, long document of statutory guidance, and in terms of, what that means for businesses, universities. I just wanted your thoughts on that, because there seems to be such a disconnect between the conversations we're having here and actually, the realistic fact that politicians are refusing to engage with this. I just wanted your thoughts.
Thanks. Could you just pass it across the aisle? Thanks. So it's blonde hair. Thank you.
Hi, thank you for this great panel. I wanted to ask the professor to talk a little bit more about his research that he recently produced and that created a bit of a fuss on X, and if you're going to pursue it further. I think there is a sort of received wisdom among media outlets. And,
sorry, could you just explain what the
research showing that fall in non-binary identities in certain college is among up to 24-year-olds, I think.
Yeah.
So there is a received wisdom that among organisations and media outlets that the next-gen consumer is kind of resolutely TQ positive, and I think, and that's all. It's all about dollar, and I think we need to challenge that. So we do need a lot more research which can show us that the young, and I know instinctively, despite the controversy and anecdotally, that Gen A and lower gender, they are moving away. And I wonder if there's going to be a bit more research to really firm that up, and because this has led to controversy. So people are always going to both sides it once there is that kind of controversy, however much you debunk. So, are you going to pursue this further? I'd love to see that.
Thank you. One more quick question with the lady in the white jacket. Thank you.
We talked a lot about the Equality Act. Should we perhaps campaign to get rid of it, given that it does appear to be the driver for a lot of problems in the workplace?
Okay, thank you. Go ahead.
Okay. First thing I should say is I'm not a lawyer, but I will certainly give my best attempt on this. I mean, in terms of government action, there's the private sector and the public sector. So I think the impact on the public sector is going to be greater because they're getting funded by the government and by taxpayers. And that's why I think it's legitimate in the public sector for the government to say, if you want to have government money, you need to be politically neutral. You can't discriminate on the basis of race or sex, for example, in giving research grants away, for example. You can't have DEI in your research criteria, no mandatory diversity. There's a whole bunch of things on higher education reform or public sector reform. Needs to be politically neutral, or if we're talking about the educational, the school sector, politically balanced. In terms of this idea of diversity, I mean, you can do it different ways. One is to get rid of DEI entirely. The other way is something I call equivalent action, which is that anything you do on race and sex, you've got to match on political ideology. So if you're going to collect data on people's race and sex when they're applying or getting promoted, you need to collect data on who they voted for and whether they voted leave or remain, for example. If you're worried about underrepresentation, you got to worry about it. So that would, I think, put a natural check on some of this behavior. A question, yes. So, had a report and tweet thread recently, and Elon and a whole bunch of accounts. It certainly went viral. What was interesting there, the point there is this is based on annual surveys from the Foundation for Individual Rights and Expression. 50,000 plus undergraduate students surveyed each year. The trends are very much a halving of non-binary identity in the last 2 years, a substantial decline in queer questioning, bisexual, sexual orientation, 10-point decline in the last 2 years. Now, of course, I was attacked in the press. They claimed they claimed a whole bunch of things, which later they sort of had to recant. But the bottom line is this research hasn't been done. Why hasn't it been done? Because anyone who says that is going to be canceled in a university setting. That it's impossible to come out and say, trans is declining, and not pay a professional penalty. So I don't expect more of this research. I will certainly do it because the University of Buckingham Center for Heterodox Social Science, that's what we're about. Whether that data exists to do it in Britain, I'll have to have a look. I'm not sure if it does exist. Last question on the Equality Act. I think that it's difficult, right? I think there are some decent things in the Equality Act, whether you can get rid of it or not. I'm not enough of a lawyer to know, but I definitely think the government needs to be issuing much clearer guidance that props up the free speech side and makes it very clear when free speech and equality are in collision, under what circumstances does one triumph over the other? So, for example, free speech in academia, it must dominate over considerations around the Equality Act. That needs to be made clear, but also the government actually needs to be proactively monitoring these bodies, and because all of these bodies are just naturally going to repopulate themselves with people who believe in woke. Unless you are actively pushing against what we know of as O'Sullivan's Law, that any institution that's not avowedly right-wing is going to drift leftward. And I'd say the same about the judiciary. You actually need to be very clear that these institutions are not pushing politics, which they often do using euphemisms. They'll use who can be against inclusion, right? Who can be against, equality? But of course, under those labels, they smuggle in, for example, anti-white, anti-male discrimination. or cancel culture. So I just think a much clearer and tighter oversight by central government of these arm's length bodies. Don't trust them not to be political, because they will be political.
I'm just going to add a couple of things. I thought there are a few other forces at play, which maybe we haven't mentioned, which I think bits are starting to drop off HR. I don't know if you want to say it's collapsing or it's crumbling, but it's definitely not in good shape. And the people that I have seen don't seem to be accepting the fact that their industry is in very, very, very big trouble here. I think part of that is the fact that there are a lot of the people, well, not a lot of them, there are a lot of people who are very good in HR. They don't realise how bad things are out there, which I think everyone in this room probably would accept. And the people that are bad don't realise that they're bad. And I came into contact with them in the wild at the CIPD Festival of Work conference that some of you may have enjoyed. I mean, it was Festival of the Midwits. Really. And I'm prepared to say that publicly. These are people who, I think, because a lot of people have a degree these days, a lot of people can kind of pass as clever when they're not clever, but they pass as clever just enough to get like a clever person job, but they're actually not terribly bright because there's no curiosity, there's no critical thinking. I mean, I thought I was a midwit, and then I went to this conference. I was like, turns out I'm a genius, which is... because I'm using my brain here. I mean, and lots of these people happen to be women as well. That was very noticeable. There are plenty of midwit men out there. They just don't work in HR. I've got theories about where they do work. But, we can come back to that another time. So I think there's that. And I think there's also... I'm seeing signs of woke kind of eating itself. I went to the Stonewall Workplace Conference.
You are brave, wow.
Well, yeah, and you know who I went with? I went with Maya Forstater, so that's even braver. So, yeah, Maya Forstater and I turned up at the Stonewall Conference. I mean, and there were the Queers for Palestine were outside, and they were picketing Stonewall, and it's like, Maya and I thought we were going to be the big story at this thing, and we were like, what is going on here? So it's like starting to bits are dropping off this thing. Manchester Pride's in really bad shape. I mean, when you have people like Ash Sarkar and Jamila Jamil saying, actually, I think we might have pushed this a bit far, maybe we need to recalibrate, I think you maybe realise that you are indeed in trouble. I think the LGBT community, if that thing even exists, which actually I'm not sure it does, but I think there's a thought that what they would call cis gay men are now taking over that movement completely, and so that is starting to. I don't know if you saw Keir Starmer's Pride garden party. Didn't look like an event I wanted to be at, but I don't know. But that was basically gay men and Keir Starmer in a garden. And a couple of trans women, and I didn't see any lesbians, I didn't see any trans men, and it's like, what are we seeing here? Are we seeing people who were born male taking over a movement that is supposed to be kind of equal for everybody? So I think there are sort of signs of that as well. I've just got time for maybe 2 more questions. This gentleman here on the right, wait for the mic.
For those that can't see, I'm a wheelchair user, so can I just say that the definition of disability needs to return to where you do have bits falling off you. That was the original definition, and anyone that doesn't follow that is disabled themselves. Can I ask a kind of a connected question? How much of this can be solved by therapy and/or enforced medical retirement for the midwits?
Good question. There's a lady here.
That's good.
In the middle. Thanks.
Thank you. I just wondered what your thoughts are on unions, because it might be that business is coming to the idea of kind of go woke, go broke. But in a world where particularly we are moving right in politics, my personal view is it's really important that we keep workers' rights to the fore. And historically, that should have been unions that have been doing that. But in my experience, unions are not really waking up to the go woke, go broke. I think they're disintegrating because they don't do anything. But they are, in my experience, some of the most excruciatingly woke organisations in existence. And I just wondered what your thoughts are about that, because I think keeping unions is really important.
Yeah, really good questions. I enjoyed the point about therapy, and of course we do know there is a link between being woke and actually having various forms of mental illness. I'm not saying that's the driver, but certainly the improvement in mental illness, certainly in the U.S. undergraduate population over the last 3 years, one of my arguments is this is one reason why we see a decline in that sort of trans and queer identification. But just to the point about the unions, I would say that what you notice in the unions is that the busybodies, the people who kind of seem to work their way up into leadership positions, are always the extreme radicals. Certainly that was the case in higher education. I was never a member of the UCU, but Joe Grady, people like that. There seems to be quite weak democratic, the democratic processes seem quite weak and seem to allow just the very committed religious fundamentalist types to get to the top of these organizations. And I don't know whether there's anything legally that could be done to ensure that you must have X% of your membership support before you go forward. I'm not enough of a lawyer again, but I think something has to happen because these, any association where it's self-selection could be foundations, could be unions, they all seem to be going rabidly in this direction. And I don't know what you do about it.
I just want to pick up on the therapy point because I think it's actually really important. And I think one of the reasons I was actually drawn to your work initially was because I think a lot of this stuff is deeply, deeply personal and actually not, I mean, it does have, there are aspects of it that are political as well, but I think if you listen to DEI, any kind of diversity training session or any kind of diversity webinar with any of these people on it, they just talk about themselves for like the first third of the conversation. And it's all about, I was adopted, or, I'm, a child of, my mother's a single mother or whatever, and it's all about their own stuff. And I think this is the therapy for them. I think their role has become therapy, which I think is extremely unhealthy. I'd also point to the lived experience external trainers who come in. I'm particularly concerned actually about neurodiversity, because I think there's a lot of young people coming in who are making a living from coming in with their fidget toys and with this huge list of demands for things that they need at work. I mean, I don't think it's a great advert for being included and integrating into the workforce. And I think we do want to integrate as many people as possible. There's a lot of people with a lot of difficulties, but many of these can be managed in the workplace. And I think going in with a huge long list and presenting it as if this is what it is, I think is not terribly helpful. I'd also point to the number of middle-aged gay men who I think are using the trans agenda as a sort of inner child therapy, going back to rescue the little boy who frankly had a tough childhood, a tough time at school, and a tough early adulthood. And I see that more and more. The women are looking to me like the foot soldiers and the kind of enforcers, but it's really within banking, within law, within retail, within media. More and more of it I'm seeing coming from gay men, and they can't see the difference between identifying as trans and being gay. They just haven't got that at all. But it's really not about empathy for those groups. It's really about themselves, I think.
That's fascinating. I mean, part of it. Part of it too. I mean, I was also I'm going to ask you, since you know the industry really well, is how much is there any emphasis on resilience and assertiveness for, minoritized, let's say, groups? Because I mean, that to me would be a major. If I were to say, I'd like to see DEI move into that area to try and bring people up rather than knock down whoever they see as the oppressor. And I don't know whether that's a trend that could ever get hold in DEI.
They, at the same time as doing DEI, where there's a lot of this victim narrative, they're also, the big corporations, they're also doing resilience training. And it's quite clear to me that those two things are fighting against each other. So I think there's a lot, they're complaining about, young people are very intolerant, and they're very, they're very unresilient, and what do we do at the same time as bringing this stuff in? So I think those two things are competing, and that's exactly the kind of conversation that I want to have when I bring the employers together for this new thing, which is actually called This Is Working. So I'll bring them together, because actually all of these things are kind of related. I think some of you are interested in seeing some of these themes. So I think they will start to see that themselves, and maybe we can move forward. And then you wanted to just add before we wrap up?
Well, what I should add is, of course, these corporations exist in a ecosystem which is shaped by the public morality. And I think ultimately, until we rebalance that public morality away from just the care, harm, and equality values for minority groups, I mean, I think there's always going to be the temptation to lapse back into this. So, I mean, corporations can do a certain amount, but we really, all of us need to work on kind of rebalancing that public morality a bit more.
Okay, well, hopefully we'll continue to see more change and a bit more balance and some standards returning to the workplace. Thank you so much for joining us, and thank you so much for coming.